Good morning, everybody. I'm Lorraine Wood. I'm the Director of Arena, and I'm delighted to welcome you to Arena's virtual event, which is entitled From Reopening Roadmap to Recovery. And today's event is in partnership with CGA. It's actually going to be in two parts. So the first part of the event is going to be a presentation from Karl, who is CGA's Business Unit Director, and he'll actually be looking at the impact of the pandemic on the sector. He's also going to be looking at where we are on the roadmap and also the trends to watch during our recovery. So the second part of the event today is actually going to be an interview conducted by Peter Martin, who is the founder and executive director of Peach 2020. Now, Peter is going to be interviewing two very, very different operators, William Lees, the managing director of JWLees, and also Mel Marriott, the founder and MD of Darwin Wallace, who'll be picking up on the trends presented by Karl and what this means for their businesses. And Peter will give you a little bit more information about their businesses when he introduces them. Don't forget, you'll actually have the opportunity to ask questions to both Karl and our panelists. So please put these in the Q&A box at the bottom, not the chat box though. Make sure it's the Q&A box. And then Peter will actually weave some of your questions throughout his interview, and we'll also go through ones that we don't ask throughout the interview at the end of the session. If you'd like to follow us on Twitter and tweet about today's event, you can follow us on @Arena Networking, and the hashtag is AskArena. So without further ado, I'd now like to introduce you to Karl Chessell. As I say, welcome, Karl. Lovely to have you here.
Thank you, Lorraine. Pleasure.
And I'm going to leave you now in Karl's capable hands, who's going to take you through his presentation. So over to you, Karl.
Thank you, Lorraine, and good morning, everyone. I've been reliably informed that if people can't see slides, they're going to interrupt me. So hopefully everyone can read. What I'm going to do, as Lorraine said, is take you through what we're seeing from a data perspective as we start to measure the recovery, coming through the roadmap and approaching Freedom Day. But also talk about some of those key trends to watch, some of them short term, some of them more medium and long term. So I've got kind of three sections really, looking at the impacts of the pandemic on our sector, the disproportionate impact that the pandemic's had on hospitality. Looking then at where we are on this roadmap, so as we're moving through the phases, what are we seeing in terms of reopenings and performance of the sector? And then finally, the kind of bulk really is on these trends to watch. I think is going to be really interesting. What does that all mean as we start to move forward? So starting then with the impacts of the pandemic. And as I said, hospitality has been disproportionately impacted, and it's impossible to underestimate that. Obviously at CGA, we like to measure stuff, and we work with UK hospitality on a quarterly tracker, and this eye-watering amount of revenue that's been lost by the sector of 80 billion from the 12 months at the end of March 2020 to the end of March 2021. We've also lost an awful lot of venues as well. So as well as lost revenues, we now have 9,300 less venues than we had pre-pandemic. So this is for a 14-month period from the end of March 20 to the end of May 2021 from our market recovery monitor. And so again, a really stark reminder really of how disproportionately affected the sector has been. This is driven by more closures than you'd see in a normal year, but it's also been driven by a lack of openings. And just to put this into context, in 2019, we lost around 2,000 net premises. So you can see the sheer scale and impact on the sector. We hoping now that we are very much through the worst, through some business leader research that we conducted in May. This is very senior leaders in the sector. They're telling us that around 1 in 10 are still planning to close sites, but they're relatively small proportions of the estates. So most of the closures that are planned to happen, we believe have happened. The good news is that ultimately people are now going to look to open as well. So as I said, we've seen a lack of new openings through the last 12 to 14 months. What leaders are telling us now is that they plan to open as they move forward. So 58% planning to open sites within the next 12 months. It's geared more towards larger operators, and those that are opening sites are planning to open around 4.1. We're also expecting some M&A activity. We've seen a lot of refinancing. There are some acquisitions definitely in the pipeline, but also we're hoping to see new entrants. And again, this is what business leaders are telling us they expect to see. So around a third are expecting new entrants into the market at higher levels than we're seeing in 2019. And this is really important for the sector. It's fresh ideas, it's fresh investment, and will contribute to the regeneration of the sector. You'd think with all that lost revenue, with all those closures, that the mood in the sector would be pretty gloomy. But actually we track optimism in the sector, and we've done it, as you can see on this graph, for a long period of time on a quarterly basis. And actually it's particularly high at the moment. So it was pretty high pre-EU referendum. It then plummeted. The uncertainty that decision brought, when the sector generally wants to remain, meant that there was a real hit on optimism. It then ebbed and flowed for quite a while. Optimism in people's own businesses was higher than the market. And it seems a long time ago, but in 2020, February, when we presented a similar slide in London, I can recall that there was a high level of optimism in the room. There was at least a decision around Brexit, and people could start to plan around that. Obviously, we didn't know what was going to happen at that point. Optimism through 2020 was extremely low, but we're now at levels we've not seen for over 6 years. And that optimism is in both the market and in people's own businesses. So definitely a sense that we've been through an awful lot and we can't underestimate that. But as people look forward with a 12-month horizon, there is a high degree of optimism within the sector. We've also seen that since the sector has reopened, that most businesses have been ahead of their expectations. Clearly, people have realigned their expectations, but as you can see here, nearly 60% ahead of expectations and only 8% below expectations. So generally, the sector has been remarkably resilient, and people are trading well. Operators have done an exceptional job of opening and of trading. That said, when we look at May performance, so this is our barometer for the managed sector. So around 60 pub, bar and restaurants contribute to the Coffer CGA business tracker. We're now comparing to 2019 rather than year on year, understandably. And you can see that like for likes down around 15%. So again, given the restrictions that are still in place in May, that's a remarkable achievement, I think. That said, we still have a number of licenses closed, and you can see the total sales are down over a quarter. So in any normal period, that loss of revenue would be a real challenge, and clearly it still is a challenge. So again, demonstrating that the sector is starting to pull some good performance figures, but still it's a challenge. And actually it's a challenge in terms of profit, because whilst people are ahead of expectations, whilst trade is reasonably good for those venues open, many are still not open. And as you can see here, only 16%, this is our May research, are currently making a profit, and many expecting to make a profit in Q2, and you can see the majority in Q3, but there's some businesses that aren't expected to make a profit for quite some time. So again, highlighting the need for continued support. It's good, obviously, the debt enforcement moratorium being extended, but the trade bodies and the sector itself is still pushing for more financial support to ensure that the sector is here in a strong footing to really help the economy and obviously our sector in particular. I haven't highlighted too much in terms of challenges within here. Obviously, the revenues and profitability are a challenge, supply chain is, but I just thought I'd touch on people, because this is the sort of number one thing that people are talking to us about at the moment. Many people expected there to be staff shortages, but they've been worse than expected in the main. So 51% have greater challenges around staff shortages than they expected. Exactly the same percentage around a reduced pool of potential candidates to recruit from. So this is a real issue for the sector. It was expected to be an issue, but not quite to this extent. And obviously one of the concerns around Brexit was a lack of EU workers. And certainly by the end of 2021, almost every business leader is telling us they expect front of house or back of house staff shortages. So this next section on where we are on the roadmap, obviously not in timings, we're all pretty clear on that, but I think it's interesting to look at the numbers and how we've moved through the various phases. When we got to the end of April, bearing in mind in England at least, trade could open for outdoor trading from the 12th of April. By the end of the month, we had around a third of licensed premises open, very much geared towards pubs, food pubs in particular, that had outdoor space like beer gardens, also things like car parks that they could dedicate to outdoor dining and convert. Casual dining and restaurants generally were slower to reopen, either not having the outdoor space, some challenges over rent negotiations, but certainly that lack of outdoor space for casual dining and restaurants was an issue, and many just chose not to open. By the end of May in our report, we had nearly 1 in 4 venues still to open, so over 75% of venues were open, which is good to see. Most pub segments and restaurant segments were now over 90% levels of openings. So many of those that were still remaining and not permanently closed were now open. Some were going through refurb, speaking to some operators, and as I highlighted earlier, a number won't fundamentally open. It's the late night sector, understandably, and sports and social that are really lagging in reopenings and bringing down the overall numbers. I think again just goes to highlight that the sector isn't out of the woods yet. There's still some way to go to get the sector back fully open. I just wanted to touch briefly on some regional disparities. So there are some disparities in tenure. Independents slower to reopen because they tend to be quite prevalent in that late night and sports and social sectors. You can see here that London is lagging in terms of openings. It's obviously very much the core square mile, Canary Wharf, where people are having to make tough decisions about when to open, and drink-led venues are opening much slower than food-led venues. I know some of the London suburbs have much more higher levels of openings. But you can see that London is lagging behind the likes of Nottingham and York and Bristol, other key cities. Not too surprising given the lack of tourists and the lack of events, as well as obviously lack of workers. But as we're moving through these phases, the one good thing to highlight is that consumers are much more optimistic than they were 6 months and 12 months ago, and they're much more engaged with the sector. They really want to come back, and we've seen a level of pent-up demand that we predicted translating into those performance figures and people returning to the sector. Over a quarter are planning to go out more often than they did pre-COVID, and nearly a quarter are planning to spend more. So this is some encouragement from what consumers are telling us with our consumer research. 65% of consumers are planning to live more in the moment, and over half are planning to go back at every opportunity. So we've missed occasions, we've missed the spontaneity of meeting up with friends and family, and this all really lends itself well to the great experiences that hospitality delivers. In terms of consumers returning, they returned much quicker this time than post the 2020 easing of restrictions. So after July in 2020, people were a lot more cautious about coming out. Many understood the hard work that the sector had done to make them feel safe, and we started to see numbers snowball, but it took time. Actually, this time, 3/4 of consumers telling us they're ready to come back to the sector in April. What you can see is that peaks quite quickly, and by the end of June, the intent was 81% to come back. So this was April research. So by the end of June, still 19% of the population still to come back, and that's very much led down to the concerns around the pandemic, around health. The good news, I guess, for the sector is those 81% are the most engaged with the sector, are the people that go out most and spend more. But we're still coming out, obviously, of a global pandemic. So understandably, some people are going to be concerned, and things like the Delta variant are clearly not helping in building that confidence with those remaining people. In terms of the key changes of drivers that sort of pre-COVID to post-COVID, as you can see here, and not surprisingly, cleanliness, feeling safe have really grown in importance. I quite like the fact that number 3, quality of food and drinks, has come through. Actually, we've seen this in a lot of our research. People have missed the quality that they can get in venues that they can't always replicate at home. And quality has become a really important driver as we've moved forward. Not surprisingly, some of those factors that have decreased in importance are having busy venues, like some of the more ambient factors like decoration and live music and so on. And I think that's clearly led by the restrictions, but also, again, where we've come from and the social distancing that's been in place. What I've highlighted in the title there is that for now point. So actually people are prioritizing safety. They're also looking at quality and less bothered about busy sort of atmospheric venues, but that is a short-term thing, I think. And when we came out of the lockdown again in 2020, we saw that consumers got more fussy as they came out more frequently, and they wanted those experiences. So my final section then is on some of these trends to watch. And as I highlighted at the start, I'm looking at these through slightly different time lenses, sort of short-term, medium-term, and long-term. We could all debate this. I mean, this is led by what leaders are telling us, it's by what consumers are telling us, but clearly none of us have a perfect crystal ball on this. But pedestrianisation of the streets for hospitality. So what we've seen as hospitality reopened for outdoor opening is quite a lot of cooperation between business improvement districts, between local councils, allowing certain streets to be offered up to hospitality. So we've seen this in Soho. Those who are familiar with Liverpool has a Liverpool Without Walls scheme. So this has been really beneficial to allow some outdoor trading, allow venues to get open. And generally, we see that as a short term. So there are some long-term decisions being made about pedestrianising cities. So this is George Street in Edinburgh, an artist's impression. We're planning to pedestrianise long-term. Parts of Manchester are going to be offered up long-term for pedestrianisation, which will benefit hospitality. So Northern Quarter being the prime example. But some of the, so there will be some examples of this, but I think the short-term spilling of hospitality onto neighbourhood pavements we see as a short-term thing, and hopefully an area though that there can be some good cooperation between local authorities and hospitality moving forward. The second trend is this alfresco hospitality. So we've all eaten outdoors, we've all had some great experiences. I've certainly sat in a venue near me in Poynton, sort of sheltering a bit from the rain. So it's not been easy for operators, but they've done an amazing job of providing venues where there is covers, there are heaters, but clearly we're going to be at the whim of the British weather moving forward. So whilst we've seen many people happy to engage with outdoor dining, and there's been good investment, I think it's very much going to depend on the operator and almost on a site-by-site basis. So there's some really good examples of venues that have invested in outdoor space that are fairly weatherproof. A good example here in Birmingham. But that kind of idea where people have given up parts of their car park, again, a good example here of a pub being able to trade with as much outdoor space as possible. But we see this as a relatively short term in terms of that kind of type of alfresco hospitality. And the other key thing that we've seen actually is a big satisfaction bounce. So people have been really happy with their visits to venues. We've saw pent-up demand, but actually when people have gone back in our brand trap metrics, their scores have raised across lots of different operators and across the market as a whole on lots of different factors. We see this as a short-term thing. We know that consumers are fussy. I highlighted earlier that once people have come back, enjoyed their first few visits, they start to look for some of those experiences. And this is the slide from 2020, looking at August versus July. And as people came back more frequently, things like the importance of hygiene and cleanliness were taken as a given. So they're not going to be unimportant, of course, but that was coming down in terms of a driver. Quality went to number one. Things like level of service, atmosphere started to rise in importance. And I think, again, we will see that as we move forward. And one of the medium-term trends I'm going to talk about is localization. So this is fairly multifaceted. So we've seen consumers have to stay local through the pandemic. We've been encouraged to stay local. And obviously, as you can see there on the slide, 70% of commuters who previously planned to work previous commuters to work now plan to work from home more often. So the idea of hybrid working that is well talked about is very much coming through in our data. And you combine that with the fact that 80% of consumers are initially focusing their visits locally or within 20-minute travelling time, then that's going to benefit suburban pubs. And we've seen that, and again, talking to many operators, they premiumised their range in some of their suburban pubs, they've reviewed their menus. So it's been a boost to some of those suburban locations. And I don't think that's something we think is going to go away in a hurry, particularly with things like the hybrid working staying long term. The other notable factor is it's not just about wanting to stay local because of logistical reasons, it's also about supporting local as well. 21% of consumers telling us that they want to support hospitality venues initially and focus on independent ones. They want to support local businesses and they will try to eat out and drink out more frequently locally. So there's a drive to support local as well as stay local. One of the long-term challenges is going to be for city centres, and I think it's going to take a gradual period of time for many cities to return to pre-pandemic levels. I highlighted that London had opened slower than some other key cities. What we saw, though, actually, we looked at this in February in our market recovery monitor, is that some key cities were actually more resilient than secondary cities. So the likes of Manchester, Leeds, Liverpool, Birmingham, their levels of closures through the pandemic have been slower and lower, than we've seen around some secondary cities like Swansea, Exeter, Wolverhampton, places like that. So actually, I think there will be some key regional magnets cities that will do okay long term, and it's perhaps those secondary ones that we need to watch. But longer term, the hope will be that people will return to cities. It's just to do what and in what form. So it might be London, I think, obviously ultimately being our capital. It's our centre for a lot of our events. So that will take some time, but London will, I think, ultimately return in a form. But it's exactly to what extent. I think it'll be really interesting to measure as we move forward. But as I say, I don't think we've seen the death of the city by any stretch, but it will take some time to recover. And the next one I want to talk about is polarization. So we've seen quite clearly in our data that some people are still premiumizing. They are focusing on quality, as I talked about, and therefore that's going to benefit some of those operators at the premium end or suppliers at the premium end. We've seen equally a number of consumers looking at value, and some of this has led to the fact that there are clearly going to be financial impacts of the pandemic. So we have a big national debt built up. There is going to be unemployment amongst some groups of the population, and what we're seeing generally is a lot of people looking to save a bit more money and being a bit more cautious about their spend. That said, a good thing for the sector is they're prioritising their spend on hospitality. So eating and drinking out to where people want to spend that time. Obviously, we can't holiday abroad as easily at the moment, so there's going to be the staycation, which will also benefit hospitality for the short to medium term. But generally, this trend of people prioritising experiences and rather than just buying more stuff, I think is important, and I think the sector will benefit from that. But as I say, we will see a degree of polarisation, and that middle ground, I think, was a bit saturated in terms of casual dining pre-pandemic, and we saw a shakeout and some closures in that area. And again, we think that's an area to watch. We don't think premiumisation is going to go away, though. At CGA, we've been tracking this, and it feel obliged actually pretty much in every presentation to talk about it, and that's because it's a trend that just continues pretty much unabated. I talked about the desire for quality. I talked about some premiumisation of ranges in suburban locations. Some of our initial data as we come out of the lockdown this time on the roadmap is that people are drinking more premium drinks. So we've seen this sort of grow. So 43% of consumers drinking premium expensive drinks went out. When you compare just looking at long alcoholic drinks, you can see in the pink 2021 figures versus the orange, which is the 2019 figures. And you can see that standard lager has been declining, but world lager, premium lager is increasing. And we've also seen a big drive in kind of treat occasions. So things like cocktails, people have obviously struggled to replicate those at home and are spending more on those as they've returned to the sector. Next trend is around demand for different day parts. So operators have had to obviously spread out visits because of social distancing and a lack of covers. So I think that's going to benefit this, and perhaps even different days of week. But also what we've seen is even pre-pandemic, people focusing on all-day brunches or bottomless brunches, afternoon tea. So I think operators have been skilled to actually ensure that they can be busy as many times as possible through this period, and we expect this to continue long-term, operators to encourage that, and also consumers to be more receptive to that. And I think one of the key trends that I'd have to talk about really is omnichannel. We've seen a huge growth in people leveraging their brand in different settings. So we've seen that in grocery with the likes of Pizza Express historically, Reds with their barbecue sauce. We've got people like Yo offering kiosks in co-ops and things like that. So people who've built up a brand that has equity looking to use that in different settings. Obviously, the biggest example is delivery. And many people, 69% of those who have increased their delivery during lockdown or have ordered for the first time, plan to do that more so as we continue. And you can see that's around restaurants, so 61% planning to continue their frequency of ordering from restaurants, 70% from takeaways, but also many from pubs as well. And we've seen this clearly in the figures. We're tracking this in a hospitality at home tracker, and you can see the numbers are through the roof. They're not going to continue at that level, but it's clearly here to stay. And some of that has been driven by delivery. Some of that, this is almost a subheading to the other one, has been delivered by these first-class meal kits and people being able to either have a kit that they can cook at home or something that's oven ready, like the Coke examples. I like this example, which is 9 Lives in London, where not only do you get a degree of food and drink, but you also get a Spotify playlist, some of the smells that go with it. So quite a neat experience in a box for people. And people have been willing to spend a fair amount of money on this. So some of the brands that have done really well, like Coates, like the Hawksmoors, are obviously at the premium end. And generally, people have been happy to spend money. And we expect to see this coming through in drink as well. I had some good cocktails delivered from Alchemist, for example. And the next trend is digital. So we've seen consumers having to pre-plan their visits when they're in venue using order and pay. Obviously, operators have engaged with this really, really quickly as well. So this has been a real step change, I think. Technology was there. Operators were struggling, I suppose, with how to maximize the benefits of it. Some have been forced to use it and have actually seen the long-term benefits. And technology only ever moves in one way. So we expect this to continue. And nearly half of consumers are planning their visits in more detail than they did pre-pandemic. They're booking beforehand. The digital journey is not just about digital, it's also about table service, which can kind of a digital element to it as well. But that whole customer journey has changed. And generally, consumers have been satisfied by it, which I think is a really important note to take. We've seen it adopted quicker by the younger population, but actually across all age groups, satisfaction is high. And when you get that adoption, you get those high levels of satisfaction. We think in the main, it's going to be here to stay, maybe dial back a little bit as we get back to more vertical drinking, but certainly for food-led occasions, here to stay. And a couple more to quickly cover. Health, a consistent driver, but has grown through the pandemic, 10 percentage points versus February. When we're looking at new food trends, 30% of consumers are encouraged to try food based on whether it's a healthy alternative. But not just about low calorie, it's also people looking at things like fermentation, foods that are good for the gut, like kimchi. And my final trend is sustainability. A key trend that we again saw pre-pandemic. I presented at Peach 2020 about this very topic. It's a really important driver for consumers. They really care about the values of a brand and a venue that they go to, and that relies to ethics, talks to ethics, but very much about sustainability. It's a really, really important driver that's only growing. People are caring more about their planet as well as their personal health. And I know it's great to have Mel here because I know that Darwin Wallace are very well known for this. I've got an example here about Feng Sushi in London, who really focus on this heavily, making sure that any oil is converted to biodiesel. The thing I really like about them is, whilst they rely on Asian ingredients, they don't import them from Asia. They work really closely with local producers, local farmers, to make sure they really reduce those food miles. But sustainability is very much a core part of their being. So to summarise then, I've covered quite a lot there. Just to highlight the disproportionate effect again, it's hard to underestimate, and certainly when you see that figure, 80 billion of lost revenue, it's a very stark figure. We've also lost over 9,000 venues, but despite that, there is optimism in the sector. I think people taking that 12-month horizon. We've had an easing in capacity, so those people still trading. That demand is still there to go around. That's important. So we've got 3 and 4 licensed premises now open, so we're still not there on the recovery. We still need that freedom day, so late night in particular can open. And just talking to those trends really. So I think some of them we see as short term. As I say, we could debate exactly where we'd all fit them, but pedestrianisation in terms of that spilling out, that alfresco hospitality because of our seasonality is going to be a challenge, but there will some people that will continue down that road. Other trends we think are more medium term, like localization and polarization. But finally, there are some that are long term. So that omnichannel growth, the use of tech, and some of those core drivers that were always there but have really stepped up, like health and sustainability, we feel are going to be more important long term. So I'm going to stop sharing at this point. Thank you very much. And I believe I'm going to hand back to Lorraine. Thank you, Lorraine.
Thank you, Karl. That was really interesting insight into the industry, and I hope everyone who's listening and watching has taken away some really interesting information that you can use back in your businesses. So now we're actually going to move on to the second part of our webinar today, and look at how these trends are actually translating out in the industry. So can I please hand you over to Peter Martin, who will introduce our next guest. So thank you very much, Peter, and it's over to you.
Thank you, Lorraine. Yeah, that was interesting from Karl. But now we're actually going to delve a bit deeper into some of those trends, talking to operators. First, we've got Mel Marriott, managing director of Darwin Wallace, the London-based bar and restaurant business, which is actually a relatively young operation, certainly compared with that which is driven by Will Lees-Jones up there in the Northwest. Will is CEO of a long-standing family brewer, JWLees. So we've got an interesting contrast in perspectives today. So Mel, let me start with you. Let's get a sense of where you are coming back from reopening with Darwin Wallace. I mean, are you completely up and running again? Have you got all your sites open?
Hi, Peter, and thanks, Karl. That was really interesting. Yeah, in answer to your question, Peter, we have thankfully got all 8 sites up and running, and we've had them all open since we were able to trade inside as well. But we had 6 open out of the 8 when we could only trade outdoors. And I'm really happy to say that, you know, we're very fortunate. We've got large venues, very airy, lots of outside space, and in locations that are busy. You know, we're in lots of London villages, so we've been really fortunate. And even Canary Wharf, Karl mentioned Canary. Opened a bar in November in Canary Wharf, our first foray east, and traded it for 4 months before we had to completely close it, obviously. And so that was, you know, it's been a worry, but it's been really interesting. And again, plays to lots of things that Karl was talking about, that when we have been, you know, we've wanted to work with Canary Wharf and be part of the recovery there to make sure that there's still some vibrancy and it wasn't just a ghost town. And it's really interesting because we always knew that there was, you know, reasonable amounts of local, you know, there's a community there, and a more flats, more homes than you might imagine. And so the positive is that where we've lost, absolutely, you know, we do not have yet the office workers, you know, the footfall there is a fraction of what it was intended, you know, what it usually is. But the weekends have been a revelation. So, you know, it does bode well. So I'm thankful for that.
So basically you're trading, you're actually, luckily you're trading pretty well at the moment. So how, you know, Karl was talking about like for like trying to give away everything, but actually, you know, how's that comparing with 2 years ago? Are you getting to where you want to be? Yeah,
I mean, I think we're very heavily positive like for like against 2019, and I think that's driven by, you know, the fact we have these expansive venues and they've got outside space, and there's been a lot of activity. For example, in the site in Battersea Power Station, they've been brilliant at trying to activate the outside space as well and work with, you know, give us more, and Ealing. So yeah, we're in a very fortunate position in that regard. And again, you know, it is a slight, it's certainly a bubble, Peter, because there are fewer. You know, there have been fewer operators open, there's less competition, and I think we have the edge in terms of people feeling secure. We've got a very credible food offer that runs all day, so it just gives us more opportunities. And obviously, you know, we haven't been able to operate as bars for the last 15 months, but you know, we've had the ability to socially distance inside and you know, give meals and operate all day. So I think that's, you know, certainly, you know, it's been huge for us.
Yeah. So basically, you've seen that customer demand, and you've been able to adapt to that demand. Will, how's it looking up there in the Northwest? Because in a sense, you've got a bigger estate, and it's more diverse because you've got city centre sites, but also you've got a lot in the country, and also you not just in Northwest England, you're into Wales as well. So what's the outlook up in the Northwest for you?
Well, thank you, Peter. We're in 150 different sites, 26 different local authorities. We're dealing with the Welsh, who are less generous than the English in terms of support. And at the moment, we're pretty much still in survival mode on the basis that Greater Manchester has been in special measures since the end of July last year. And when Boris announced the extra 4 weeks delay to the 19th of July. Now, if you go back to the 22nd of February, he said at the time, we're going to support you for 4 months. And so the difference between the 21st of June and the 19th of July is business critical for a lot of people. And I think that whilst the rent moratorium, it just kicks the can down the road, it doesn't really make a huge amount of difference. And so at the moment, I think we're at a time where trading is actually pretty good. Our like-for-likes are the same as loungers. We're 26% up like-for-like compared to 2019 in the 4 weeks since the 17th of May. But our teams are absolutely knackered. And people say, we really like table service, we don't want to go back to the bar. And you go, well, if you really like table service, then you're going to have to pay quite a bit more for it.
Yeah.
And so, at this moment in time, our business is loss-making. We expect June to be the first month that we're back in profit for quite some time. And I think we're in that most dangerous position because whilst we're open, there's this terrible battle for staffing. I think we're starting to see shortages of product. A lot of cocktail ingredients are not there. And the other side of it is that we've got the nightmare of football. And everybody says, "Oh, isn't it good we got football?" No, you're completely wrong. When football is on terrestrial channels, it's always terrible for the on-trader. We've seen lots of people put screens into restaurants, really bad idea, happens every 2 years, and they take them down again. And at the moment, because of social distancing measures, people are choosing to have barbecues, get people round to their homes, and to enjoy that wonderful feeling of doing things together. And so, for me, this is probably the most precarious part of the crisis because we all think we're doing okay, but we haven't seen what our balance sheets look like. We need to rebuild them.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point because although trading is coming back, and I think we're seeing that not for everybody, because obviously if you're in a nightclub market, you've got massive problems. But I mean, you've highlighted the staff issue, the financial issue because of the debts that the business is brought up, government not necessarily understanding how things work in the sector, and also the supply chain. So let's pick one of those. Let's start probably the one, and Karl mentioned it, the one which I think is front of mind at the moment is the staff issue. Staff shortages, people were expecting it and it's certainly coming true. Mel, let's bring you back in on here. I mean, what sort of issues have you got with staff? Are you seeing that in your business? And then we'll see how Will's finding it.
Yeah, I mean, it is absolutely, it's a huge issue. We're operating with closed borders, nobody in, nobody out. Brexit's, complete disaster in terms of the supply, the supply of individuals that want to come and spend a year or 2 years in the UK, work in hospitality. It's absolutely awful. So the difficulty is that whilst we retained the vast majority of the people that we went into lockdown with, that's not enough people to cope with the summer levels of the levels of trade that we've got. So we're having to, and again, this is, we're all saying our teams are tired. They've gone back into quite a busy, hard work scenario, like getting back into it. They've still got loads of restrictions to deal with, still got to wear masks for long periods of time, and it's just really hard. And it is absolutely the thing that keeps me awake at night worrying about them, because I feel so. What we're trying to do is recruit sufficient, and again, the additional impact on the teams of trying to train and recruit new team members coming in as well. It just puts it's kind of all condensed into this month or 5-6 weeks that we're trying to get the right numbers up, and then you find that you've trained somebody for 2 weeks, and somebody, unfortunately, there are some unscrupulous operators who are literally coming in with a £1 an hour extra, and you've lost them. And, again, some of them, they're being lured away with promises of additional tronc and this, that, and the other, and then they come back 2 weeks later because they find out that hasn't actually manifested itself. But it's very much an ongoing pressure, and I can't see how it's going to ease unless we do something, or we can, facilitate. I mean, there are very much longer term ways that we need to attract people.
So Can you put a number on how many staff you're down at the moment, and what is the biggest cause of that? Because I mean, you mentioned a lot of things. It's people not coming back. Is it Brexit? Is it pay? Is it conditions? What's?
I genuinely think the biggest issue is Brexit, and the fact that we just have got a reduced pool of people who would like to work in the summer or through the year in our business. For me, that is absolutely the biggest thing. I think some people have had a change of what they'd like to do. The other issue is that some the mental health issues and the anxiety of people who are missing their families overseas is meaning that they want to go back to their countries and then they can't get back again. We've got a constant flow of people self-isolating to try and get back again. It's in quarantining, and it's just really, really difficult. And I think it's going to get, we might talk about this later, but we developed an app in the first lockdown, and it's been well utilised. And I think actually it's saving our bacon at the moment, because we can operate with fewer people on some very busy shifts.
Yeah.
But again, it's not going to say, we need barmen. We need barmen when we can get people to come to the bar. We can't wait for that to happen, but we need to find them and train them. And I really don't know what the answer is, apart from to try and provide, make sure that people aren't working crazy hours, make sure that when they're on site, they're looked after and they're fed, and we're mindful of what they're going through on a shift. Yeah. Other than that, we really need a bigger supply of people coming in that want to work in the business. We need when the furlough comes, maybe that will release some more people towards the end of September who are currently not working but on furlough still in our industry. It's still a big percentage. Yeah. So,
we will be coming back to digital. I mean, it's quite interesting, Will. I mean, Mel sort of highlighted Brexit there. I mean, to put it in context, we are seeing other countries, certainly if you're in New York, in Berlin, that we've got those shortages because people aren't coming back. But it seems to me that perhaps what Mel's saying is that Brexit will be a longer term barrier to people returning. What's your fix on the shortage problem, and how bad is it for you? You're on mute, sir.
There we go, back in the room. It's worse than I've ever known it. In May, I've not got the stats for June yet, but in May we recruited 160 people and 90 people left us out of a workforce of 1,400. One of the things that's really starting to irritate me, and I think Mel's in the same position, is some of our competitors who are poaching our people. So my message to them, if they're watching, is just stop, because you're going to create a nightmare for the sector. But structurally, we've got, in my mind, two issues. Firstly, nobody came out of catering college last year because it's one of those things that you just can't do on the end of a Zoom. Also, no students took up jobs as bar work, apart from my daughter, who perhaps knew someone who could get her a job. But you get into the people who get their first job working in a bar, and then they say, do you know what, I really like hospitality, I'm not going to go back to uni. And we've seen it time and time again. And we've got a great reputation for developing people. We probably put on double the number of courses that we should, but it makes us a sort of sticky employer, which I think is really good. And one of the things I learned many years ago, we used to get people, they say, oh, I used to work for Living Ventures. And actually, when you picked up the phone to Tim and Jeremy and said, what did they used to do? They go, oh, they're a glass collector, and we were really glad that we got rid of them. And what we're going to see, in my mind, is once we've got over this sort of crazy summer, so to speak, people will work out who's a good employer, who's a bad employer. But in the meantime, it's a real problem. And so we're now having to close venues because we can't staff those venues. And I'm actually more concerned about the availability of particularly younger teams who are getting pinged by test and trace than I am about the roadmap on the 19th of July. And so I wouldn't have imagined it, but these are the things that we've been dealing with now for 16 months. But we now have half a dozen venues closed on certain days of the week just because we can't run them and put in reasonable shifts for people to work in them.
Yeah, in terms of, that's a very good point. It's unintended consequences, isn't it? Because you're using test and trace is starting to work, but it's hitting younger people because they're not vaccinated, and that means you're short on shifts.
Well, I think there's a bigger problem, because last week Test and Trace started using their Bluetooth.
Yeah.
And so what we're
People
seeing
moving around, yeah.
What we're seeing is that the government's not very good at technology at the first place, and so if you've been in the same venue as someone, you're being advised not to advised to go and isolate. People are quite good at doing what they're told because people have been frightened for quite a long time, and the other side of it is that younger people are breaking the rules. They're turning the app off. They're not following things as much as they might do, and so we are seeing increased incidents. And of course, everybody's then becomes an expert in these things. But it's going to be a tense few weeks, I think.
Yeah. And Mel, I mean, looking forward, I mean, we're seeing initiatives coming out, whether it's UK hospitality, whether it's other people in the marketing world about trying to improve the image of the industry. I mean, do you think image is still an issue? Is there something we can do collectively?
I think image is absolutely still an issue, and I try whenever I can, and whenever anyone will listen to me, I talk about my own experience of spending 4 years at uni and doing a degree in economics. But in my summer holidays, I worked in a wine bar in York, and when the owner of the wine bar offered me the opportunity to go and run it for him at the end, I immediately ditched all my ideas of going to work in the city, because I was so excited about the prospect of working, having a business to run, socializing with all the team, and meeting the guests. It was just brilliant and vibrant, and that was the beginning of a 30-year career in hospitality. And the thing that I also talk about a lot with our GMs and our senior teams is that each of them is running a multi-million-pound business, and they have day-to-day responsibility for a multi-million-pound business. They have all of the, obviously they're supported centrally to a degree, but they actually have all of the regulatory responsibility. They have the responsibility to look after their guests. They have the responsibility to keep the venues safe. They have all of these things, and then they have the responsibility, generating this enormous revenues and managing it to a degree. It's anybody who underestimates that as a career, they're just wrong, basically. And they can also be well rewarded for it as well, because this, the pay levels are not, I think there's a disconnect between what people think about what the pay levels are in hospitality and what the reality is and what the opportunities are.
Yeah, I think we need to get that, because as you know, my oldest son is a GM in London. So, and again, some people still think all he does is pull pints, but he's running a multi-million-pound business. And I think the pub. Anyway, well, the other bit on, because we could talk about people for a long while, but there's the other side of the people in terms of shortages is we're seeing on supply side. Now, obviously, your other bit of your business as well as running pubs is you brew beer. So, I mean, are you seeing that in terms of, everyone's talking about driver shortages at the moment? Is that hitting you, Will, on the supply side as well?
Well, our beer business has been pretty resilient. What we're finding, though, is that because of table service, people are tending to order famous international brands, typically premium brands. The bigger problem we have is with our wine spirit wholesale business, where there's sort of catastrophic product shortages, which are half caused by Brexit and half caused by this spike in demand. At the moment, I don't think anybody wants to panic anybody, but there basically aren't any 11-gallon containers available in the UK because everybody's moved from 22s to 11s. And so what we're seeing is, with a large number of venues closed, particularly a lot of those big volume live entertainment venues, you've just got containers stuck in the wrong places, whether those are shipping containers at ports or whether they're barrels and kegs that are stuck in venues. And you've got some fairly simple things that, the way that we clean our barrels is not set up for them to be sitting around for a year, so to speak. So you're suddenly doing double cleaning. And, I think one of the big things that we have really neglected is the environment, that all of this, outside heaters and leaving all the windows open, that we've just forgotten about the environment the last 12 months. And so from a not getting back to the sort of priorities that we all know that we should be getting back to. We took, for instance, a position on outside heaters where we just said, right, we're not buying them anymore. They're illegal in France. We've got COP coming up in Glasgow. So let's stop kidding ourselves, heating the outside air. It's not a very smart idea. So let's just stop doing it. But going back to your original question, Peter, there's there are issues, and everybody knows what products are on limited availability. And the other side of it is the on-trade is getting neglected because the supermarkets have got supply agreements in place where suppliers get fined if they don't supply. And so I'm afraid that the on-trade is at the back of the queue. And my conspiracy theory then goes that international brand owners are playing very dirty games to get their brands on the bar, which is going to push lots of our fantastic craft brewers out of business because they just can't get a route to market. Yeah,
it's interesting now. I mean, I heard probably slightly different, actually, that some craft beers suppliers who are probably well set up are probably looking after pubs better because, as it were, the owners are actually delivering, whereas some of the bigger supply businesses are having more problems because of the driver stuff. But obviously, it's a pretty of a mixed picture out there. But anyway.
Yeah, I think that's happening. But the trouble is that the owner can only supply so much. And again, one of the areas that we've struggled with is people are reticent to put cask beer back on the bar just on the basis if they're not going to sell it in 3 or 4 days, then they're going to have to throw it away. So it's a risk that a lot of people just don't want to take.
Yeah, true. It's interesting, and that's the whole point. It's the complexity of the issue and the normal unintended consequences, and there's different parts of it. I mean, Mel, from your point of view, are you getting the supplies you want, or are you seeing shortages in the supply chain? Bearing in mind, a lot of our audience are actually in the supply business and probably feeling that pain from the other side.
Yeah, you've got to, it is really difficult, operationally to, list. We've run out of, rosé suddenly. There's no rosé anywhere, and that was becoming really difficult because there was a container stuck, God knows where. Yeah. We ran out of Camden had underestimated the volume. And I wouldn't know the ins and outs, but they'd underestimated the volume, the demand, and because it's not pasteurised, we had to wait 2 weeks. Yeah, they were brilliant at letting us know and being, super apologetic about it and all the rest of it. But it is, it's just a reality at the moment. There is always something that we can't get, and it might be a premium spirit, it might be a mixer, it might be, beer, it might, all it's across the piece, and it's really affecting the food supply chain as well. And a lot of the issues that we're seeing on the food supply chain, so the fishmonger and it is the driver issue, or it's where at one point it was where they'd, actually there weren't enough venues open in central London, for example, for them to, commercially be able to put a truck on into town to come and deliver because they weren't going around enough venues. So we're working really hard with them because some of them are really small suppliers to be flexible from our point of view. So flexibility on our menu, putting things on and off, trying to work with them to get them back on their feet as well as us.
Yeah, I mean, it is tricky. I mean, I heard stories of chief executive in the quoted bar business actually having a trailer on the back of his car, actually helping to move product between different sites and different parts of the country. It's like that. I mean, is this a short-term issue? And Karl was talking about short-term. Is this a longer-term issue for you because of Brexit? Are you going to change the way you do things, perhaps rationalise your menu or your ranges or your suppliers?
We've already rationalised the food side to a degree, but also, it's guest driven at first. People were, just happy to be out and but then we saw in our repeat guests, people were asking, when's this dish coming back on? We're missing that and this, that, and the other. And you have to listen to that, you have to try and make it work. So I do think that there are definitely going to be wine supply issues actually many years ago now, when Brexit was first a thing and it was first announced, then we worked very hard to make sure that all of our food ingredients are actually sourced as near as damn it from the UK and locally as possible. And that's, part of the way do business, but we also import, well, we don't import, but we use, you know, international wines. So we're all affected. We're all going to be affected to a degree, and I can't see. I think some of the local food supply issues will go away as more venues are open. There's a bit more consistency, and people get back into the swing, and there's more drivers. But I think some of the, you know, the import-export issues are just here for a while, because it hasn't been thought through, the mechanics of it. People are, you know, just not bothering because they can't, you know, the logistics of trying to organise these things are just horrendous.
Yeah. I mean, Will, from your point of view, I mean, are you, again, sort of changing the way your supply chain works? Not just you supplying beer, but also, more importantly, what's coming into your pubs? And probably how much is that consumer driven as well?
Basically, our suppliers have been fantastic. And at the beginning, when cash was king, and cash still is king, I phoned all 414 suppliers that we deal with. And it was one of those things, we had a team meeting and said, I'll phone the suppliers. And from the biggest company in the world to the smallest fishmonger who delivers himself. And I said to all of them, I said, can you give us a bit more credit? Because we're going to pay you, but can we just have a bit of time, because we're managing our cash. And so we have the green, amber and red list of, there's people we will never do business with ever again. And there's people we will give more business to. And I want our suppliers to survive. And the thing that I find is that I've spent a lot of time through the pandemic on Zooms to ministers and the like. And my conclusion is that the government haven't got a clue about how business works. Yeah. Emma at BBPA, Kate at UKH have done a fantastic job to make us get grants and get support. But even something like the curfew rule that, you know, when Sacha Lord was talking the other day about egress rules of people leaving festivals, and you just think, you know, there's someone that knows what they're talking about. The other side of it is the health lobby. The health lobby are the enemy. They want people to stay at home and listen to them talking on television shows about health. They do not want people to go out and have a good time and drink alcohol. Mm-hmm. And I think that we really need to remember that, because we are optimists and we are risk takers, and we encourage people to go out and spontaneously have a good time. And I think a lot of the things that we've had to put in place, whether they're apps or bookings, or they just take the joy out of hospitality, because I just want to be able to walk into a bar, see if I can get served, because that's always quite cool if you do get served before the person next door. You know, when we interview for GMs, we want a GM to be someone that you would want to have a pint with. We don't want someone who's really good at back office. You know, we want people to be welcoming, and for their pub or their pub restaurant to be the heart of their community. So I think a lot of the things that we're being forced to do, we've got to remember we're only doing them because we have to. And when we can get back into being hospitable again, that we'll be in a much better place. Yeah,
I mean, it's interesting you say about what consumers want or don't want. I mean, digital is, let's move on to that. Digital has become a way of life for a lot of people. And, you know, it's not just going out for hospitality. It is for ordering online. I mean, there's more vans on the road than even pre-pandemic at the moment, because Amazon is winning. But obviously, how does technology, from your point of view, and hospitality and technology work together? Because people are planning, you know, where they can go, because there is, in a sense, a concern about, you know, can we get in, you know, what are, you know, how, there are people that are concerned about health as well. People want to pay quickly, particularly if they're at table, but you've got hospitality. I mean, digital is not going out of people's lives, but how are you implementing that in yours? And I mean, Mel's mentioned her app, and I'll come back to that in a minute, but I mean, how do you see it? Because obviously you are fundamentally a hospitality type, and you want people to enjoy life, but there is this digital wraparound in hospitality we can't get away from.
Yeah, I love digital, and I think that it's something that, if it drives down costs and makes things more efficient, it's great. And so, for instance, all of our servers now have iPads that link to the tills. We have remote PDQ machines. One of the things actually that served us very, very well is not taking reservations. By just having walk-ins, we've not had this problem of having to return deposits and the like. And so that works when you've got good weather and you've got people in sites where there's high levels of footfall. And if you go back to when Tesco first did Clubcard, they made it way too complicated. And they then reined it back and they made it a lot simpler. And I think at the moment, there's a lot of hospitality operators, they're asking for too much data. It's too intrusive. They're going to end up with problems with ransomware or whatever, because they've got lots of people's pay details and the like, and they're just going to blow it. But if you can get it right, and there's not that many people that are that good at it in hospitality, then I think you're onto a winner. But even something as simple as, would you like to book a hotel with us direct rather than go through booking.com, it is a lot more complicated than you think it is when you start out. So, you know, in my mind, we've got a long way to go, but we need to embrace it.
Yeah, Mel, I mean, you mentioned your app, and you trade in London. You probably, you know, your customer base is pretty digital literate, bearing in mind some young metropolitans, as you were. So, you know, what's your experience? How much is digital part of now the Darwin and Wallace experience, as it were?
I mean, well, so we in the first lockdown. We began work and developed the app, and it's order and pay, click and collect, book online. It, you know, has a variety of functions. And the thing was, it was an opportunity for me, because I've always had this issue of inefficiency, where we've got some big outside spaces where people don't want to get up, or have to get up and walk quite a distance to go to the bar, or it's very inefficient to try and do it. You know, you'd have to have an enormous amount of team. So it's been frustrating at times. And a number of years ago, I was looking at various options like Flyplay, and the difficulty for me was that they couldn't integrate with our POS. And Will was talking about the fact that his team use iPads and this, that, and the other. And we've always been a quite tech savvy business, because we've always had iPads and people being able to do order at table with the iPads, etc. And we have a digital system as well for managing stock and all of that, because I find the efficiency of it really fascinating.
Yeah.
So having put our mind to developing this app, and we did it on a very small budget, like crazy small budget, and it's actually astonished me how people have bought into it. And it's not compulsory. I think that's one of the biggest important things about it, is that people can use it if they want to, and they don't need to if they don't want to. So you don't have to, have a sort of a face-off with a guest who is not interested in it. But having been in the business and watching, once people have done, and Will's right again about minimizing the amount of data that you have to put in just to get the thing working, download it and make it work as quickly as possible is really key. So we cut out a load of points just to simplify it, as we've been learning as we've been going along. But it's been downloaded nearly 140,000 times now, and with 8 sites. It's incredibly well used. Last week in the business, about 70% of the sales were driven through the app. So, and like I said, it's not we obviously make people aware, and for me, one of the biggest, people, I'm all about hospitality. I want people to come into my bars and have an amazing time. I don't want them to feel like they're being neglected or being forced to do something they don't want to do. So for me, the interaction is our team members, advising people about the app, checking in on them if they've managed to sort it out. It's really quite lovely when you see people gleefully getting the hang of it, and then they come back the next time and then, no, we've got it, we know what to do. And it does actually, it really is interesting in time. It has made us more efficient in terms of food service times, drink service times, and it also has allowed us to deal with some incredibly busy shifts that we would have fallen down. We would have given, in my opinion, a much worse service if we had solely been relying on people getting around the tables and taking individual orders, because essentially the guests are helping with the process. And I really think it's there to say, people love the fact that they don't have to. One of the biggest bugbears, I think, of this younger generation is having to try and attract someone's attention to pay the bill. And it drives them nuts. But actually, if you've already done it, and obviously you're paying before, but again, it's all about guest and obviously we have to deliver the food and the drink, and obviously we have to go and check if people are enjoying it, and obviously we have to then take it all the way in. So there's multiple opportunity for interaction. So I don't, and again, it's how you manage it. I wouldn't say we're doing it perfectly yet. I mean, it's a new thing, and we've only been trading for, you know, barely any time in the last 15 months. So we just have to keep looking at it. And, you know, for me, I want to see it in the future as certainly not something that's compulsory, but something that people like to use or engage in using because they feel like it helps them do what they want to do in one of our bars.
Yeah. I mean, there's a question just going from Nicola Gallagher, actually leads on quite nicely from this, and it is about how you're going to use that data, or how you're using the data and consumer insight of that. Because I mean, one of the things I've been talking to a lot of the guys who have been doing more delivery and particularly meal kits, and one of the things they've learned is once you get into that, you have to be really close to customers. You have to understand what people are buying, and probably their marketing has become more sophisticated as a result of it. You know, they're talking about things like lifetime value and customer acquisition, all the things in my old world of publishing I know well about. But it's quite interesting. So are you engaging in that? Are you doing more with that data? Are you developing your interaction with consumers?
Yeah, I think, you know, there are a number of things that we're working up to, and to be perfectly honest, Peter, I would say that we're not even close to finding the time at the moment. The teams are very much focused on being on site, and we are not. None of us have got time to sit and really dig deep in the data that we're collecting. But obviously, not everybody subscribes to opt in to be part of the ongoing conversation with us. So those that do, great. But a number don't. But in terms of what I'm sure when we can come up for air and breathe a bit, we can analyze this data and see what it's telling us. But the one thing that we've, lots of anecdotal things is that when people are just choosing different things and they're spending more time looking at the menus, like they're just being more adventurous. And it's really interesting. And I think it's because, sometimes when it's your server's arrived and you kind of make a knee-jerk quick, okay, you have the same drink that you always have day in day because you know you like it. But I think people are taking more time to read because they have a little bit of extra time. But again, all of this is just me spout. There is absolutely no statistical. Karl would be horrified. There's no empirical evidence to support.
Right. As we're talking data, let's bring Karl Chessell back in here to perhaps bring some, because obviously if one thing CJ does, it analyzes data. I mean, Karl, from a broader view, obviously you've been listening to what the guys have been saying. Obviously you're looking at a macro view. Are you seeing that perhaps more use of data? And obviously CJ lives and breathes by data. Are people becoming more sophisticated in what they're looking at in terms of consumer trends? And what are some of the other trends you're picking up, but apart from the ones you mentioned in your presentation?
Yeah, so I mean, in short, I think people are more engaged with data and trying to make data-informed decisions in the main. I mean, obviously, hospitality is very led by operational decisions and entrepreneurial flair as well. So clearly, it can't all be about data. But I think on the point of sort of the development of being able to collect personal data and being able to personalize messages, it's not an area we focus heavily on. But again, from my background, a bit like your old world, Peter, I think people are seeing this as an opportunity to capture data, whether it's through Wi-Fi, whether it's through reservations, whether it's through track and trace even, and capture marketing permissions. And I think that does present a new opportunity, but also a new challenge. And I concur with Mel. I mean, clearly there's a heck of a lot for operators to focus on at the moment. So therefore that might be in the background, but I do think it is an opportunity to capture that information, to build a one-to-one relationship with people. So I do think that it is an opportunity for people. In terms of your other question about sort of wider trends, I mean, there's almost so many. I think there was a question that popped up about sort of menus, wasn't there? And I think one of the things
so yeah, take that.
Yeah, so listening to what Mel was talking about people asking for those dishes that they've missed. I think we saw quite interestingly in the data when people opened for outdoor trading, the sheer rationalization of menus. I mean, some of that was led by having to have food that is suitable to serve outside. But from our EPOS data, we saw the average number of dishes, main dishes, go down from 24 to 14. So quite considerable rationalization. And I think there is a consideration now as to how big those menus return to. You know, Mel mentioned that there will be people wanting certain dishes, but how big, particularly given the operational challenges that William and Mel have talked about so eloquently, and the supply issues. I think that is a consideration, and for both drink and food, really, as to how bloated you want to make menus moving forward.
Yeah, Will, from your point of view, I mean, are you seeing sort of shifts in consumer habits and patterns, or are people going back to that core pub restaurant experience? And I mean, how are you staying in touch with those consumers? Is it that interaction in a pub, or are you using more digital data?
Well, without seeming too much of a dinosaur, when I first started in this business, our core customer was probably a 55-year-old bloke who'd come to the pub 4 times a week and have a few pints. And it's now a family that probably come for a meal, and they probably come once a month. And what we've seen with digital is that I've got a little crib sheet here that we in May had 124% increase in hits on our various websites compared to 2019. 17.3% people. So we had 26,252 bookings coming directly from people coming into the website, so to speak. And I think, again, in terms of simplicity, that, you know, get onto website, get to pub, get to book a table, keep it simple. We decided not to take deposits, and I know that Martin, for instance, at Arc Inspirations, he did take deposits, but you know, the amount of time that our teams have been spending cancelling or moving people's bookings, we're quite exposed to the wedding and corporate travel sector, which have obviously had a really hard time, and it's really a question of how we bring those back. And you know, the thing I would challenge companies is that it's all very well having a marketing department. You know, have you got a data scientist? Have you got someone who's got a PhD in algorithms and maths? Because that's what you need, not someone who's good at colouring in. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, marketing is not about promotions. It's really about understanding consumers and positioning. Right, well, we're coming to the end, and that's been a fascinating conversation this morning. But let's move back to one of the points you made and looking to the future. Will, I mean, it is a financial burden. I mean, you know, trading's looking good. You both said that, but looking forward, how problematic is actually getting rid of that debt burden, and how optimistic are you about going forward? And we're up against time, so a quick reply, sir, and then we'll finish off with Mel.
A very quick reply is, at the moment we're in pre-audit with our accountants. Until the 19th of July is cleared, there remains a going concern issue that every business in the sector has. And so every single one of us needs to get our balance sheets robust and to be able to think about where we want to be in 12 months' time. Because at the moment, whilst trading's good, turnover is vanity, profit is sanity.
Indeed. That's normally where we'd end, but we're going to end on Mel instead. So, you know, Mel, I mean, same question. I mean, you know, in terms of, you know, you've got external backing in the business, but where are you? I mean, you know, how difficult is that sort of debt burden on you, and how optimistic are you about being able to drive the business forward?
I think, you know, in contrast to Will's business is obviously immense compared to my business, and it's 8 sites, and they're 8 sites that have, you know, by the grace of God, are in locations where we've been able to, every time we've been able to open, we've managed to trade profitably through various means. And again, it goes to this, all our businesses are very different. Mine are all day breakfast, you know, all the way through, and so it's been possible to minimize the debt in that regard, because we've actually managed to contribute profitably at certain points. However, none of us are in as good a shape as we were, you know, going into this. And we, again, another, you know, one of the biggest boons for me has been the fact that I've literally spent more time on phones with landlords, you know, constantly, and I've had great support. So again, I think we're very fortunate in that regard. So I think I'm feeling really optimistic about. I'm optimistic about the business. I think our business is super relevant for guests and for people coming back when you know things. And I remain positive, but obviously there are many unknowns out there and many challenges. But I feel you know with our 8-site business compared to a much you know bigger geographical spread in Will's case, you know we've had some good luck.
Yeah, indeed. Well, look, thank you all for your time today. And I mean, I think what comes through is that optimism about hospitality, but also you've hit some really big issues that the industry faces. So thank you, Mel. Thank you, Will. Thank you, Karl. And back to Lorraine.
Thank you, everyone. That was a fantastic panel discussion. And also thank you very much, Karl, for your insight at the beginning. All that remains for me to say is we'd really value your feedback on today. So when you do disappear, a feedback link will come up on your browsers. So if you could fill that in, it will literally take less than a minute, because I think it's really important that when we're doing these live webinars, we really understand what you like about them, what you think we could improve, but also what you'd like to hear more of. And I know one of the big subjects that was touched upon in the discussion was the staff shortages in the industry. And that is going to be something that we're going to be focusing on in a future webinar, and the whole webinar is actually going to be devoted to staff shortages. So it is really important that you let us know what you like. So all that remains for me to say is thank you very much, Peter, Will, Karl and Mel. And who knows, one day I might be drinking in your bars sometime soon. So enjoy the sun, enjoy your weekend, and thank you, our audience, for joining us. Take care, everyone, and see you soon. Bye.